Hey everyone, this week's video is going to be slightly different. That's why I'm releasing it midweek. I've put together all the stages of my Vivarium build into one long video for newcomers. So if you've been keeping up to date with this project, you'll already have seen everything here. But anyway, let's get straight into it and I hope you enjoy. Not only is it going to be my biggest project to date in this half-a-metre tank, but I also have a very cool inhabitant for it, although I'm sure you already know what it is from the title and thumbnail. They're my dream ant colony, Polyrachis dives, although they're better known as false weavers for the awesome nests that they make. I don't want to delay it any longer, but before I can begin with the build, I need to prepare and install the hardware, so let's get to work. I moved the tank into place, which measures 30cm by 30cm by 50cm, which equates to around 45 litres. I'll also be keeping it on a neoprene mat to evenly distribute its weight. Starting off, I decided to apply a frosted background as I don't really want the wall behind to distract from the ants. I turned the tank on its side and sprayed lots of soapy water on. All the water was squeezed out and the edges were trimmed with a razor blade. As these ants from the tropics, they'll need a bit more heat. To provide this, I'm using a large heat mat. I placed it under the tank onto the mat, which I pre-cut a slit in to fit the connector. Now, to really make this feel a bit more professional and to not have loose wires everywhere, I'll be mounting a 4-way plug extender onto the stand. As is necessary for all heat sources, I'll be using a thermostat. It can handle up to 100 watts of heat sources, so if I find the ants need it in the future, I can add an overhead ceramic heater. With it, I'm also using a 3D part that I designed myself and printed. It fits the thermostat perfectly and makes it look just a little bit cleaner. As this is a special project for me, I had to get a proper light. I'm using an all-pond solutions light, which is a really good light when on a budget. With all the hardware in and my back now aching, I can finally move on to the inside of the tank. But whilst I'm working on the build, I'll remove the light for ease of access. As always, I started off with the drainage layer. I'll be using white gravel, which I rinsed thoroughly before adding. Whilst I was planning this, I was stuck between a darker or white layer. In the end, I decided to go with this colour, as I think it should really help it stand out, as this will be a bit of a feature piece in my room. Coincidentally, it also goes well with some plants that I'm planning on adding. I moved on to separating this layer from the substrate. Like usual, I'm using geotextile fabric. I cut it down to shape and trimmed it until it fit nicely. It was then added in. With this all done, I could add the substrate. This is a slightly adapted version of my usual mix. There's more cocoa husk mixed in, and the substrate as a whole should provide plenty of materials that the ants can incorporate into their webs. Now, unlike most ants, these ants don't dig, and as I just mentioned, they weave their nests. So to meet their needs, I'm keeping the soil level fairly shallow. I'm not thinking about how it looks just yet. I'll wait until the hardscape is in for that. Now that the substrate has all been added, we can move on to something a bit more exciting, the hardscape. As these are weaver ants, I want to stick mainly to wood to give them as much room as possible to weave. I've got a lot of spider wood, although most of it's probably too large, so I'll see what works as we go along. With this build in particular, I want to try and create a scape that looks fantastic from nearly any direction. Of course I want it to look good from the front, but I also want it to be pleasing when I look at it from my desk, or when I'm in bed so I can observe the colony late at night. As you saw, I tried a few different pieces on the left side before I settled on something that looked a bit like a tree trunk. There's plenty of nooks and crannies that will be perfect for the ants to begin their nesting. Then I began experimenting with the second piece. I want this side to be slightly lower, but leave a nice area to the right when observed from my bed. This stage took quite a while, and no matter how many pieces I tried, nothing seemed to quite fit my vision. Instead I went off and cut one of the large pieces in half, and was left with this piece here. It has great direction that matches the other piece, also leaves plenty of room for the ants and looks great from any direction. I then spent a while making sure all the pieces were secure by building up the soil around the bases. I also built the soil up towards the back, adjusting the topology of the ground until I had something that I was pleased with. Well, the majority of the hardscape is complete, although there's a few small tweaks I still want to make. I'm really happy with the flow of the wood, and there's plenty of hiding spots for the ants, where they can also nest. It looks great from all three directions, and it'll only get better with plants. The main thing I want to do is add a few twigs in various places. These will help fill the void under the wood on the left. I attached a piece across the top, linking the two pieces to provide a bridge that the ants will hopefully travel across. I then began to secure them with cyanoacrylate superglue, which is completely animal safe when cured. I also covered it and the surrounding areas in dry moss to add cover for the ants and to break up the large pieces of wood. I'll add more, however I'll wait until the planting for that. I've got quite a few different plants to work with, so I'll list them as and when they're used. As always, I rinse the roots off of all the soil before planting them. I'll be planting larger plants first, and further back. I began with the calathea. It has large round leaves that provide excellent cover below. Moving on, I have another calathea. This one has a purple undertone to the leaves, which are narrower than the previous one, providing a nice contrast. Whilst planting, I kept having to remind myself that I had to leave enough room for the ants to weave. As you might have guessed, I'll be using plenty of Vitonias. Along with the white variant, I also have some pink ones, but this will be a detail so they'll be added later. Smaller plants are added further forward to make it feel more natural. As I mentioned in part 1, I want this to look good from all three directions. Because of this, I made sure to include some plants to the sides. It's time to bring some colour to this scape. First of all, I'm adding some pink Vitonias. These have a really tropical vibe to them. They're added in various places to bring pops of colour to the dual island composition of the wood. I was pleased with it at this point, but I wasn't completely satisfied. It felt dark in places, so I added a vibrant Boston fern to lighten it up. They have much more vivid leaves than the other plants, again adding intrigue. Now for a final few touches, I'll be adding an air plant on the large piece of wood. It could simply be pushed into a crevice and the base was filled with sphagnum moss. There's a pink colour to its leaves, which matches with the Phottonias. A tiny little air plant was added on one of the branches using superglue. I added a few more Phottonias and Calatheas in places that looked a bit empty. With this, the planting was complete. That took quite a while, but I'm not finished just yet. I'm happy with how it's all planted, although I might add a few smaller detail plants later on. The next thing I want to address is the foreground and sides. I'm thinking of using either coarse black sand or something similar, but I'll see what works as I go along. I'm also going to incorporate moss and cocoa fibre to give the ants more materials to weave from. I know I just said I'd use black gravel, but I decided to go against this and use a bright white instead, the same as the drainage layer. This will really help the design pop. Although the gravel I'm using here is too large and I'll end up swapping it out, but more on that soon. I created a path that got narrower the further back it went. This helps create depth. There are a few voids under the wood that were unsightly, so I filled them in using dry sphagnum moss. This also gives the ants places to weave. Moving on to the exposed soil, I wasn't a fan of how it was looking, so I scattered lots of cocoa fibres on it to soften the transition. Now for the thing that will really make it look natural, leaf litter. I'm using oak leaves with a few smaller various types mixed in. It was added mainly on the sides as I want the path to stay fairly clean, for the time being at least. I'm really happy with how it's looking. It just has this jungly feel to it, and I can't wait to get the colony in. But this will have to wait. I want to add a dedicated cleanup crew now, and then I'll give the terrarium a few days to settle in before adding the colony. This will help me spot any issues that might pop up and deal with them, although I'm not expecting any. I've got a few isopods that I want to put in, so let's bring some life to the terrarium. Before this though, there was something I needed to address, the path. After a day of contemplating, I knew that I had to change the gravel. The fragment sizes were just too large and were taking away from the scape. I also thought they were too bright against the darker style. So I painstakingly removed all of it. It took a while, but looking back now, it was definitely worth the effort. Instead, I'm using a much finer Hugo Kamishi gravel. It looks quite bright now, but once sprayed down the colour becomes more neutral and natural and really complements the other components. However, I did use some of the larger gravel as accent points to add variation to the path, especially around the edges. I replaced the roots and added a few small leaves on the path. I also added another smaller air plant to the piece of wood on the right to balance the two sides and complete the scape. Now, as I mentioned, I want to add various isopods to clean up the ants' waste. I expect them to do well, although I'm not sure how the weaver ants will react to them. I'll let nature's course take place in this terrarium. I went through my isopod bins and settled on the species on screen now. Pouring them in, and very quickly they ran off in all directions. For the next few hours they'll be very much out in the open exploring this space, but after this period they should be much more secretive and I won't see them that often. They'll keep the terrarium running smoothly and might become a tasty snack for the colony every now and again. It doesn't show on camera very much, but in person there's a bit of a glare on the wood from the light, as it's a little on the bright side. The easiest way to fix this is to cover up some of the LEDs with black electrical tape. With this done, the terrarium is all complete. It's been just under a week since they added the isopods, and the terrarium's going great. I've not seen any mould or any other issues that might cause a problem, so I should be all good to add the ants. Up to this point, I've not really shown or talked about the ants, so let's do that first. They're currently housed in a small plastic tub that I've modified for their needs. Originally this was for a tarantula, but since then I've plugged the ventilation holes with cotton wool and drilled a hole in the side so I can have a thermometer probe inside to monitor the conditions. It's not very pretty, but it's done well as a temporary setup. Now for the colony. I 3D printed 2 parts to cover their test tubes at all times, although since then they've actually moved out of these and began to weave on the second piece. You can see the silk here. The nests the girls make are awesome, and I can't wait to see them undergo nest building in their new space. There's also plenty of brood. You can see some cocoons here. As some of you may be wondering, I should mention how I stop the ants crawling out. I use Fluon, which when dry is super slippery for the ants and they can't cross it. As this species are quite good climbers, I'll add a fairly wide barrier. I applied it with a paintbrush. It's not the prettiest of things, but it is necessary. It's finally time to add the ants. I added the 3D part that they were nesting on into their new space, with them all on it. Ants all over postured up to defend their space. They assume this position as this species don't have stingers. Instead, they have acidopores from which they can spray formic acid. Lone ants explored these new lands, adventuring over and under the leaf litter. Back at their nest, workers were frantically hiding the pupa that had been exposed back when I added them in. At this point, I realised that without intervention, they'd stay in their current nest for a very long time. So I took drastic measures, and with a pair of straight tweezers, I began to pull off segments of their nest until very little cover was left. During this, ants stood guard all around the scape, ready to give up their lives for the colony and queen. Speaking of the queen, there she was, much larger than all of her daughters. She wandered her way around the remains of their nest. After a few minutes, nearly all the workers had hidden themselves under the nest, with a few final ants bringing in the brood that had been left behind. At this point I could remove the 3D printed cover to again expose the colony. Some workers were still on the nest, so I brushed them off. Standing on the leaf was the colony on high alert. Again, they hid under the leaf, so I removed that as well. Ants darted all over the place, desperately trying to find a safe space for the colony. The queen hid to the side of the path with a solitary worker, whilst the rest of the colony searched for a suitable spot. With this, I left the colony for a few hours to settle in and become comfortable with their new environment. They've been in here for a couple days now, and I think they're hiding inside the wood on the left. However, there's still a couple of things I want to change. The main thing I'm going to add is a ceramic heater. They've been a bit sluggish, and this should really help wake them up. Although, I'm not going to recommend this just yet, as I've not used it before, but I'll link it in the description for those of you that are interested. Before I could attach it, I needed to prepare the terrarium. One of the calatheas was already struggling a bit, and the heat would probably finish it off, so I removed it for use in a future project. I also moved the air plant down into a crevice lower down to move it out of the direct heat. I'll be mounting the ceramic heater with a gooseneck clip-on lamp stand. It's not ideal, but for the time being I'll clip it directly to the light. When I find some time, I might make an arm that I can attach coming from behind. I screwed the bulb in. The stand itself also has a built-in dimmer switch, which will be perfect for adjusting the ambient temperature. It's time to feed them. I placed a chopped up superworm into their lands. A lone ant explored this offering. It began to nibble from one of the chunks. It ran back to the nest to tell the rest of the colony what it had found. But they didn't seem interested just yet. I guess they still need a little longer to acclimatise. I've no doubt that in a few days they'll be swarming their food once they've explored and become comfortable here. Well, it's finally all complete and I'm really happy with how it's turned out. I just love sitting here watching the ants go about their daily activities. They've dragged plenty of moss and other materials to block the entrance of their nest, although right now they've actually moved out of the wood and are nesting in a leaf behind the log. They're so active and I can't wait until they begin proper nest construction, so I'll make sure to update you guys when that finally happens. Anyway, that's all from me for this video and I'll see you all next week. So thank you so much for watching and please consider subscribing.